Artificial intelligence has had a very scary rap thanks to Hollywood and many dystopian films and TV series which show robots taking over the world or machines becoming so much more intelligent than us petty humans that we can never match their analytical or thinking capabilities. But it is not science fiction anymore, and over the last 2 decades, insane amounts of progress has been made in the use of artificial intelligence, and most of it has been groundbreakingly good. For instance, and in particular in the field of medicine, artificial intelligence has really just revolutionized things in the sense of finding cures for cancer or even reversing aging and stuff like that. But a more blaring example of the use of artificial intelligence is the speed with which the COVID-19 vaccines were created over the last year. Up until a few years, it would have been unthinkable that a vaccine could be made in anything less than a few years. But because of artificial intelligence and machine learning, millions of data points and models can be tested, they can be analyzed, and they can be simulated in a matter of minutes and sometimes days. And that is what has allowed us to get a COVID-19 vaccine. So while we discuss challenges with artificial intelligence today, it is good to remember that it might be one of the only reasons that this pandemic might not be as fatal as the Spanish flu of 1918, which had an estimated death toll of 20 to 100 million people around the world. That said, artificial intelligence and machine learning is shaping our lives in many ways on a daily basis and in ways that we might not even understand. And because more and more companies are becoming dependent on AI algorithms and machine learning in order to satisfy this need for speed that our generation has, we are being impacted every single second in some ways. For instance, AI algorithms are being used to sift through job applications. So if we don't use the right keywords or we don't have a cookie cutter resume, we might never get an interview. And then we have facial recognition, which is already part of how we turn on our phone and how we use many of the apps. And of course, it's related to a lot of surveillance in different countries. But most importantly, because AI and machine learning algorithms are trained using present data and present subsets of knowledge, it can be biased. For instance, in a skewed data set, which has majority of crimes being committed, whether they're petty or not, by people of color, and you train the machine on that data set, then it'll keep targeting those people in the future. And in a country like the United States, where mass incarceration is a problem very slowly being worked on, that would cause even greater divide and even greater incarceration of certain types of people. And such systems are being used in places like Detroit by law enforcement. One of the most well-known examples of AI bias in facial recognition technology, when a graduate student of MIT Media Center, Joy Bulamwini, was working on a system called Upbeat Walls, an interactive multimedia art project which allowed users to build colorful patterns through a machine recognizing their movements. To track the user's movement, the system used a commercial facial analysis program. But what she noticed was that the system didn't recognize her as a person when she sat in front of the camera, but when her white friend sat in front of the camera, it recognized her. And when she put on a white mask, the system again recognized her as a person. And that brought up one of the most well-known issues of facial recognition bias and gave rise to deeper research. That led her to do more research with 3 well-known and in-use facial analysis programs created by Microsoft, IBM, and Face++. And in a paper written by researchers at MIT and Stanford, the results of this show that the systems showed both racial and gender biases. Analysis from these 3 programs showed that error rates for determining the gender of light-skinned men was never worse than 0.8%. For darker-skinned women, however, the error rates ballooned to 20% in one case and were more than 34% in the other 2 programs. At this point, you might ask, so what? The problem is that Facial recognition technology and predictive analytics, which use AI algorithms, are already being used to determine whether we get a job, whether we get a loan, whether we get healthcare. And as we talked about in the last few episodes, targeted ads also use artificial intelligence algorithms in order to target particular or relevant ads to us. And while it might be a nuisance in some ways, but in other ways, there might be relevant jobs that a woman of color might never see, while a white man would be shown those jobs, or a program that would help increase our skills or make our skills better might never be marketed to us even. I want to talk about this aspect of artificial intelligence where underrepresented groups are left out of data sets. But let's step back for a second and ask a very basic question. What is artificial intelligence? The main idea behind artificial intelligence is to see if we can make a machine think like a human. Now, you might have heard artificial intelligence and machine learning being thrown around together, and the basic thing to understand is that it is using machine learning that systems are trained to perform tasks mimicking a human brain or human analytical processes. So basically, you put in one of those old school statistical models with different variables, and you put it on loop and you teach it how to maybe become better and better and process information in a more and more efficient way, and that would be considered machine learning. Or machines are just much better at processing big data and millions of data points, so they are able to see patterns across different data sets better than humans could, because of course we can't see millions of data sets at the same time. And that would be something that could be used for, let's say, natural language processing, where Google Translation can translate everything within seconds. And what I am using here with these captions being generated in multiple languages, or let's say to find text-based errors across all of Google search queries. Another interesting use is when two machines talk to each other and learn from each other and learn to be better and better while communicating with one another, and that is called reinforcement. And in this particular case, we've had the problem of deep fakes emerge, where one fake is learning from the other fake and trying to be even more real than the other fake, and then this one learns what this is doing and becomes more real. But at the end of the day, while we might hear a lot of information about machines going out of control, they are still being fed information by human beings. Human beings are determining which data sets are going to be used, which variables are the most important ones, and what combination is the necessary one. Let's think about it a little bit more. Why would machines be able to be smarter than human beings? And the simple answer for that is that we are mere mortals who need food and sleep, and we forget things. So for instance, us dumb humans forget our keys, right? And we're analyzing something really complex in our brains, but then we get out of the house and we've lost our keys. So we go all the way back and we look for our keys, and it takes some time, and then we are late. So we get stressed out, and our body releases, or our adrenal glands release more cortisol, which gets us more exhausted. And at the end of the day, we are both physically and mentally exhausted because we couldn't do an analysis at the same time as remembering to pick up our keys or drink our coffee. But you can put millions and millions and millions of data points into a machine and let it process it non-stop. Or you can put centuries worth of knowledge in a machine, and it can combine this information in multiple different ways and also spit it out whenever you need it to. So yeah, machines have better memories than us, and they have higher processing speeds. And of course, this kind of artificial intelligence increases efficiency in daily life. But the problem arises when the information that we are feeding to the machine is already biased. Then the results or solutions that it's going to come up with are also going to be biased. So for instance, for the last 50 to 100 years, if all of representation has been dominated by a very white American Hollywood, or by colonial powers writing the history of human existence, then their representation is what is being considered knowledge of the last few decades. And human beings are already pretty far behind in having equal representation of a lot of different groups. Like with the Grammys and Oscars only this year admitting that they had any kind of problems with diversity. So you add machine learning and the speed with which data is processed to this mix then, and you get a biased result, or you get a biased data set by essence of having knowledge that exists today already being biased. And when the algorithm is being trained using this data set or this pool of knowledge, then we have a bit of a problem. And some really awesome people are working on this right now. And what is of relevance today is that governments are now stepping in and they are admitting that big tech and a lot of these tech companies have become the gatekeepers of human knowledge, and it is affecting our lives on a daily basis, so they need to be regulated. When AI models determine which information shows up where, then it influences us. It becomes a problem for the government and, let's say, consumer protection. Now, it is very debatable whether algorithms can even be regulated. As we discussed in the last episode, it's sometimes hard to see where an algorithm is being used or how the algorithm is created, but policymakers are trying. And in fact, over the last few weeks, we've had a bunch of really cool stuff happen from the European Union and a little bit of action in the United States regarding coming up with AI regulation. Not to exaggerate, but we might be in the midst of a historical moment which is going to direct human future. The European Commission just released a draft of a proposal for regulating artificial intelligence geared towards guaranteeing safety and fundamental rights of people and businesses while strengthening AI uptake, investment and innovation across the EU.
It is really the versatility of artificial intelligence that makes it very special as a technology and very useful for our society and economies. Because of that, we want businesses and citizens to use artificial intelligence as much as possible. To do that, we need to address the issue of trust, and that's what we like to do with our regulatory framework.
The AI regulation has a very broad scope and covers all the different aspects of product development, sale and distribution of AI systems. And it's so broad that I can't get into it here, but essentially it takes a risk-based construct which has been used previously in terms of product safety or privacy and GDPR. And facial recognition, which is a major concern with digital surveillance, is a major part of this regulation, which falls under the high risk category, as the proposal separates 4 different variations of risk. Number 1, high risk. Critical infrastructure, education, employment rules, and other high risk areas will have AI assessed before being put on the market and throughout their life cycle. This could include stuff like credit scoring, or deny citizens the right to get a loan, or verification of authenticity of travel documents, or let's say law enforcement's use of facial recognition technologies. These will be subject to strict obligations before they can be put out in the EU market. Number 2 is unacceptable. Anything considered a clear threat to EU citizens will be banned, from social scoring by governments to toys using voice assistants that encourages dangerous behavior of children. Number 3, limited risk. Uses such as chatbots will be subject to minimal transparency obligations, so users can make informed decisions about what they're willing to share. And number 4 is minimal risk, which the government will not be interfering in, and that includes video games, spam filters, and other low risk. The vast majority of AI systems fall into this category. Now, the US has not been far behind and has been holding a couple of hearings recently about algorithmic bias and what to do about it. But what's really stirred up the tech policy community here is a blog post posted on the Federal Trade Commission's website. And the basic question being asked in the blog post is, how can we harness the benefits of AI without inadvertently introducing more bias and unfair outcomes? The post goes on to lay out certain FTC regulations in place right now which might apply to AI systems. And then the author goes on to share some best way to put it is best practices related to AI systems. These include number one, start with the right foundation. So if the data set you are using, it is excluding certain populations, then basically don't use it. Number two, watch out for discriminatory outcomes, which basically means, you should test your products for bias and other forms of discrimination. So before deploying AI systems, test them. Number three is embrace transparency and independence, which basically suggests to share your data audit or share your algorithm, or maybe make your data open source so that others can find problems in it if they exist. Number four is don't exaggerate what your algorithm can do, or exaggerate that it is unbiased, or whether it can deliver unbiased and fair results. And this is pretty self-explanatory and might even fall under a fraud category for rules that already exist. Number five is tell the truth about how you use your data. And of course, this is very much in line with the investigations into Facebook and a complaint against Facebook where they were using users' data for, machine learning algorithms and for multiple different purposes without informing users about it. Number six could fall under the previous debate about don't build algorithms and might lead to extremism or cause harm to others. And this might be very interesting to see with Google's tagline for a while, which was don't be evil. And it ends with the ominous number seven, hold yourself accountable or the FTC will do it for you. This is kind of in line with a lot of policy debate, which wants to come up with like a solid mixture of self-regulations by these companies and government regulations, because of course the government doesn't want to spend a lot of resources policing corporate activities. Now, this blog post is being hailed as a great sign for either more regulation to follow or to show that the FTC is taking algorithmic bias or the harms caused by artificial intelligence much more seriously right now. So let's see if there's more to come. To dig deeper into today's topic, we'll be talking with our expert Hong Chu. Hong is a lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School and fellow on technology and race at Stanford University. He was one of the first engineers on YouTube's startup team and is the creator of AI Blind Spot. So Hong, what is artificial intelligence in your words, and why do algorithms have potential for bias?
So I think of artificial intelligence as an aspirational technology. We're definitely not creating intelligence that's artificial. We're creating algorithms and methodologies that codify a set of rules and try to detect patterns in big data sets. And so once we detect the patterns, we try to build a model. And the model might be very accurate and may be able to even predict what future things might happen, depending on whether a new observation or a new case fits the model and it attempts to make a prediction or decision. So that's what I think algorithms today do and how they work in various aspects of society, anything from ad recommendations, content recommendations, to predicting the test scores of students, to screening resumes, and allocating healthcare resources, and so many other things. And the reason they have potential to not just cause bias, but also, more importantly, to be harmful to certain groups of population and people and individuals is many of the algorithms are written without knowledge of the context of the people who are subjected to these algorithms. When I worked at YouTube, I worked on teams that built many of these algorithms for, let's say, related videos or detecting fraudulent activity. And we always focused on the outliers. We tried to find some of the most relevant, but also some of the most improbable activities. But we didn't have a context of how can we ensure that at the individual level, every person who's subjected to these algorithms have a sense of personhood, right to fundamental human and civil rights, and also, if nothing else, be given a level of human dignity that everyone deserves. I think as engineers, that's not something that comes naturally, and we don't think in terms of the requirements that maybe some of the legal counsel or the policymakers prescribe when they have protected classes to ensure there's a minimum level of protection against harm. And that's why I feel like AI, as it's deployed and affects people's lives, in specifically certain subpopulations, subgroups who just in society are already being treated unfairly, will codify and ossify these rules and maybe continue to amplify these historical trends that we're trying to prevent and do better with.
Can you talk a little bit about how has AI bias impacted society today? What are different ways in which it is affecting our daily lives? Why policymakers are trying to regulate it?
Sure. So with a team of data scientists and civil society leaders, I'm working on a project called AI Blind Spot. And the notion is that in AI systems, the people who are building these technologies and services and deploying them in real life situations have to be aware of their own blind spots, have to be willing to find those harmful impacts, and if worse comes to worse, have to set criteria, not just to mitigate or to fix these biases, but to actually shut down these services and AI systems altogether. It's really important because in society, there's always winners and losers. And we already have such a widening, increasing gap in wealth and income today. The probability or the trends might be exacerbated by automated decision-making left up to these algorithms, because the stakeholders who have a say in how to shape these algorithms, how to set the rules and make the rules for the code, they are sometimes unintentionally creating these negative consequences, but at times maybe intentional in setting these gatekeeping functions. So that's why we're working together closely with civil society organizations to identify who's being harmed, how they're being harmed, how they may be co-creators and participate in the decision-making process. To sum all this up, I think a lot of it is the history, the sociology, the psychology of all the people who hold the power. So it's a matter of the cultural norms, the ideologies, and also the dynamics and structures of power that determines whether AI systems work towards social justice or continue to exacerbate unfair outcomes.
And what I think about this is how a representation of particular groups is already so behind. And a lot of my work was about women's representation and like how much needed it is, how it's been lagging behind, how we're like almost centuries behind in having like women's texts published or women making media themselves, stuff like that. And it's interesting because I was writing this, like a few years ago, like the AI technology has progressed much faster than we have been able to catch up with these baseline issues of representation. And if the algorithms are being trained on what already exists, then basically technology has gone way farther ahead than even equalizing historical representation. So there's kind of like no other way to go but to fall into this kind of like exclusionary pit of technology. It will be exclusionary because knowledge has been exclusionary historically.
That's exactly what I'm seeing when I try to analyze and unravel some of the research in AI ethics. I think we often think that with the assumption that AI systems are impartial, unlike humans, because they never have a bad day, they don't have a bad attitude, they don't have prejudices. It's all fair because the rules are set and they just apply the rules. So you can't blame the algorithm, you can't blame the machine. That's a very naive and sometimes a pernicious way of categorizing automated decision-making by AI systems. You can't divorce the historical context. You cannot train it with data that's not representative, as you said. The data that it sees is not just all the goodness of humanity, but also all the cruelty and the injustices that we perpetrate. Therefore, I don't know of any algorithm that can distinguish and discern the difference between these two. So if you take all of the internet images or the internet, let's say Reddit conversations, there will be tremendous bias, and that has been happening again and again in these big AI models that's trained on these imperfect or even these very gross exhibits of human behavior that happens sometimes on the internet. Therefore, I think the question is not so much how do you have just a representative data set, because that's an easy way out. That's maybe a technical solution. And these technical solutions tend to actually cause more harm and create more unknowns and unexpected outcomes. What we really have to be aware of is we have to understand history. And once we understand the history, I like to use the term, we need to level the playing field for everyone to have equal opportunity and equal access to live a fulfilling life, to have life chances that some of us may enjoy, but not all of us today. And so if that's the kind of purpose of AI systems, then anyone who's building these systems, including the corporations who attest to having responsible AI, accountable AI, transparent AI, they also should declare this is their mission, this is their purpose, even if there's some sacrifices for them in terms of business objectives. Right now, I think that's not the case. And that's why we're seeing this kind of tug of war within many organizations between doing the ethical thing and doing the profit-driven shareholder wealth accumulation way of applying AI. I'm not saying you can't reconcile these two, but I think it takes a lot of serious conversations, a lot of high level decision-making in order to create this combination, this blending of AI for level the playing field for everyone to have an equal chance in life. And that hasn't changed. That's still always the end goal of not just technology, but anything in society. So I think that's the right thing to do.
And that's why we're seeing regulators get involved with this. And regulators around the world have started drafting AI regulations, with the European Union taking the first steps with the proposal that they launched I think a few days ago, a draft of a proposal towards harmonized rules on artificial intelligence. Can you talk a little bit about, have you read the proposal? Like, what's in it? And I guess the question, as usual, is this even implementable? What's in the draft?
Yeah, so first I have to preface this by saying I'm definitely not a policy expert because I'm learning as I go. I come from a user-centered design background, and I worked in industry for many, many years in journalism, in these tech platforms. But just about 3 years ago, I switched my career path to go into understanding public policy, law, and thinking of ways to regulate or set norms and standards for emerging technologies such as AI. So given my understanding, I break down policy into maybe 3 or 4 stages. The first stage is this making of the policy, awareness that we need some regulation, some rules of the road, and possibly you draft it and maybe the next step is to pass it. And once you pass the regulation, which I think the EU has not passed their AI policy yet, but they have passed GDPR, which is already passed. So after it's been passed, the next stage may be to implement it. And implementing a policy is not as easy as it sounds. You have to interpret it. You have to make sure everyone knows about it so they follow the policy and stay within the rules. And there's lots of lawyers involved. I'm sure all the GDPR, I acknowledge this cookies clicks, that's implementation. And then even post-implementation, there's enforcement, which is probably the toughest thing, to maybe have a court or a regulator say you violated this law, and therefore maybe you're, legally liable. You should pay a penalty, or you should make whole the person you harmed. And that is rarely done and very hard to kind of, quote unquote, get those cases through the system to the finish line and then to maybe set some precedent. There's another route where, if the policy is enforced, then is it enforced the same way harmoniously around the world, even within a single country or jurisdiction? And then, how should we set expectations for every player around this? So I realized that writing code actually feels like pretty simple compared to this whole policy making and regulation work. And once you make it and you pass it, you can't just iterate like every 2 weeks. You better make sure it's good for 5-10 years at least. So look at some of the safe harbor Communication Decency Act. It's taken more than 20 years to even think about changing these laws. So there's a lot of pressure to get everything in order and do it right, including there needs to be a very sophisticated understanding of product and consumer psychology and the incentives for all the different players in the marketplace. And therefore, I feel like we're just in like taking the baby step, the very first kind of learning to crawl, not even to walk from a regulatory perspective. And kind of values, the principles make a lot of sense. I think the Europeans are far ahead of the Americans in thinking of data and digital and privacy rights as opposed to consumer protection, meaning if the company harms you, you as a consumer want to get some financial benefit. It shouldn't be that way. It should be you have a right to your data. If the corporations or any entity uses your data without your permission in a different context and doesn't have this kind of data minimization, this spirit of limiting the secondary uses of your data, then they're at fault. They already, gone beyond my willingness to provide my data for multiple users, which happens a lot when I was at Google or YouTube. They'll throw anyone's data into this machine learning algorithm for AI systems without a second thought. They say, oh, it's anonymized, so who cares? It's in the aggregate. I feel like that's a big mistake. The rule should be in the context, should be holding to the integrity of that single context, whether it's search or Gmail or anything, but not for another context to use it as a secondary other than that specific use. I think that would protect people's rights and give them much more power over their data flows will be under their own control. Therefore, the Europeans, I think, have the right spirit in mind. It's a matter of the actual implementation now. And some people have already reacted very strongly against these rules because they say you're killing AI, you're killing the whole marketplace and the industry of AI by imposing these requirements for high-stake AI decisions that needs to be transparent, that needs to be explainable, that needs to be registered and monitored, and that needs to have a sense of due process and recourse. But I think in order to protect everyone's fundamental rights and human dignity, that's something we all have to be willing to go do the extra work and set up these processes. Otherwise, I think, at least for myself, I don't want any part of it. I don't want to work for those organizations that produce those kind of products that may be harmful. So that's my personal take on where we are and where we should be going.
The US has also been holding a couple of hearings about algorithmic bias lately. And the FTC posted a blog that created quite a stir, which was, more like best practices for AI deployment. But if you look at the EU regulations with the high risk or low risk AI systems or deployment, how would, and if let's say ad tech falls into this, right? I wonder like what you think is going to happen with first like US regulations and the conversations that are happening here. And second, if let's say they were to follow European footsteps, how would that affect the business models for big tech?
So I think, again, these are very early days of regulation, and the hearings themselves are just trying to identify the problems, to define the problem space in the US. So I believe the US will have its own path. The Europeans will have their own path. Many different states in the US will have their own path. And this kind of, in a way, kind of competition and iteration approach to regulation may be a good thing, because you have good ideas that will arise out of this mixing of ideas. And maybe we can incorporate some of the best ones into one set of ultimately standardized regulations. But I think just going straight to the business model question, with if there was very strict guidelines and prohibitions, requirements for high stake AI systems that may get in the way of people's life chances and treat people unequally based on a variety of possible biases that seep into these systems. I think it's best to actually do the research to know where the problem arises, and to interpret and to be able to explain the problems, just like any product. I'm learning that in legal theory, legal scholarship, you ask the people who are creating a product that they should have a duty to care, to make sure the product works, is safe, is reliable, been tested. So first you ask the question, are the issues foreseeable? And if they are foreseeable, then is there any negligence in the team that's building it to not foresee it? And then if there is negligence, are they culpable? And if they are culpable, then what kind of liabilities should they have? And once they're liable, what kind of penalties or punishment should they have to live with? And then that's typically the logic of how to hold the developers and the operators of AI systems accountable, and also to deter future abuses of the technology to harm certain vulnerable populations. You have to think of AI as nothing more than an agent. Even before technology, we always had agents. Every bureaucracy had a set of rules, and you had civil servants, contractors actually executing these set of rules as agents of these systems. And the making of these rules has to be very transparent and scrutinized. Therefore, AI, I don't think, should be any different. AI algorithms, AI systems, AI decision-making should be explainable and should be understood, and should offer whoever's been denied a chance, not just explanation, but a counterfactual, a way for them to, improve their application to be approved. And they also should have recourse if they are harmed. For example, we are doing some research on rental screening applications. If someone who applied for an apartment is required to do a background check, and for whatever reason the background check inaccurately or unfairly denies them the rental property, and they lose the rental to someone else, they should have some recourse, because in fact they are qualified, but the technology was at fault. So all these protections for the consumer should be written into the regulation. The businesses should operate and be guided by these rules. And I think ultimately, once there's clarity around these, regulatory expectations and requirements, it's best for everyone. And I would just add one last thing I noticed, is that you notice that facial recognition is one of the most contested spaces, because it tries to identify people by their face and possibly try to guess at their gender or their race. I think one of the reasons facial recognition is easier to contest is because we know how our face looks like. We know our own identities. There is a ground truth of what are the facts. that we could agree upon. But many of these other algorithms that try to predict social outcomes, such as your ability to do a job based on the resume or your, video interview, it's maybe a lot more subjective and it's less subject to a ground truth reality. We don't know until maybe when they actually do the job, whether they're good at the job. But the algorithms pretend to, be very decisive and know what outcomes will happen. Therefore, the transparency is even more urgent and more necessary, because unlike biometrics and facial recognition, to contest algorithms that are high stakes, that prevent people from to be given opportunities to be shown ads, for example, for a job they are very qualified for because of some random bias, not random, but some glitch in the system that creates this algorithmic bias and data bias. We have to be able to catch that at every point, just as like any product should be able to catch its bugs and its issues to guarantee a good experience, a good product. That's by the definition what we are aiming to do. So it's very important to have this feedback loop in my mind.
Thank you, Hong, so much for your time and for explaining all of this to us.